I want to talk to you today about waging peace. I mentioned Veterans Day, and the reality is we live in a very violent and war-torn world. And yet, for those of us who call ourselves people of faith, especially those of us who call ourselves Christians, one of our primary vocations is to peacemaking. Now, this isn't just a theoretical thing. This is a choice that you make every day that you get out of bed, for every relationship, every encounter, every day, every time you get in the car, every time you talk to somebody, every time you go to the supermarket, every time you go to church. You have a choice to make. Are you going to be waging war or waging peace? Promoting hostility or tranquility? Building walls or building bridges? That's the choice that you and I have to make every day. Are we going to commit our lives to the ministry of waging peace? First, I want to say that peacemaking is God's family business. Steve read the beautiful little section in Matthew 5 earlier. We call it the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Who are the ones that have the right to call God Father or call God Mother? They are the ones who wage peace, because peacemaking is God's family business. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called God's children. They're the family members of God. By our very calling, by our very nature as people of faith, we're called to this. We're called into this. As Paul said, God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself, and he's committed to us the ministry of reconciliation. He came, Paul said, and preached peace to those who are near and peace to those who are far off, and said, now you go and do the same. Not just preaching it, but living it, making it happen. I listed 5 points up here, 1 down and 4 to go, and I want to tell you about 4 people who illustrate peacemaking for me with the remaining 4 points. Peacemaking is multidimensional. It begins inside of us, within us, in our own hearts. That's the reconciliation with God. That's the vertical part. That's the personal part. But as I like to say, our faith is always personal, but it's never private. There's a horizontal dimension. So we find that deep inner peace, that connection with the divine, and then we're obligated and compelled to go out and make peace with the world, with other people. That's just the way it works. You can't have the vertical without the horizontal. So we talk about making peace in relationships, making peace in our homes, making peace in our workplaces, making peace with our neighbors, making peace in the world. Now that gets to be a big chunk to bite off. You talk about world peace, but it can happen on a very personal level. So I'll tell you my first story. It happened in Bly, Oregon. Lived in Oregon for 6 years, not too far from this little rural community called Bly, Oregon. Bly, Oregon was the site of the only U.S. deaths during World War II on the continental United States. There are only 6 people who actually died, aside from Pearl Harbor. I'm talking about the continental U.S. 6 people died, and those 6 people died in Bly, Oregon. And this is how it happened. During the war, the Japanese sent a number of balloon bombs across the Pacific, some of which landed on the West Coast. Most of them dissipated. They went down over the ocean. A few landed on the West Coast. These bombs are very crude devices. They were very crude little bombs, and they were attached to a helium-filled big paper balloon, and they drifted all the way across the ocean. As it turns out, these balloons were made by school children in the nation of Japan who were employed by the Army or who were constricted by the Army to build these balloons. So some of them made it over to Oregon. One of them actually landed. It landed in a rural area where a young minister and his pregnant wife were having a church picnic with a group of children. And when they saw the device, they gathered around it, it exploded, and the young minister's wife, pregnant wife, and 5 children were killed by the bomb. 1945. Some 50 years later, a group of ladies in Japan who had been involved as schoolgirls in making these paper balloons were able to track down the victims of the bombing and track down this now very elderly retired minister, Reverend Archie Mitchell. And they sent notes of apology, and they sent 1,000 paper cranes. As the Wheelers know, a symbol of peace. And eventually they were able to actually come together in the United States and have a reconciliation. 89-year-old Reverend Archie Mitchell opened his heart, said, "I never harbored this resentment or anger. It was just an act of war, and as Christians, we're obligated to forgive." And Mrs. Tanaka, one of the school children who actually made one of the balloons, who had felt so guilty her whole life for having been complicit in this awful thing, broke down in tears, and they embraced. It was a beautiful moment, an act of reconciliation. So they had the interior dimension of peace, and then they had the exterior. Peacemaking is multidimensional. Number 3, peacemaking demands a lot of dialogue and deep listening and mutual understanding. It doesn't mean we don't speak the truth in love, we're not frank and candid, and it doesn't mean we never get angry, but it means we really work at hearing what the other person is really saying, understanding them. I'm not talking about compromise, I'm talking about comprehension. We do so little of that in our culture. We do so little of that in the church. We're always ready with a retort, a rebuttal, to give my opinion. But to be with a person and go to that very deep level of really listening and understanding how they're feeling, understanding how they look at a situation, understanding how they experienced a situation. I had a beautiful thing happen in one of my churches. It was in Florida. I was with 2 older adults. One, a quite fascinating lady, Elizabeth, who at 45 years old went back to school and got a PhD in psychology. She's been an activist all of her life. At one time, she was a dorm mother at Kent State University. She was a dorm mother at Kent State University in 1970 when 4 students were killed by the Ohio National Guard. Many others wounded as they protested the Vietnam War. Some of you remember that. These were her girls. These were her children, her students. And she took a lifetime to recover from that. So there was Elizabeth, and there was John. John was a 19-year-old ex-Marine coming back from a tour in Vietnam. And John remembers when he got off the plane, people weren't applauding for him, people spat on him, because there was such an anti-war sentiment at the time. So here's Elizabeth and her experience of Kent State and how the National Guard mowed down these innocent students. And here's John, who loves his country and remembers the kind of reaction he got. And they were just locking horns about militarism and U.S. policy and the war in Vietnam. And as they began to talk more and more and listen more and more, they began to, for the first time, understand the perspective of the other in a way they never had. I saw it happen right there, right in front of me. It was a beautiful moment to see that coming together from people with two different total experiences of the same event. So, peacemaking demands that kind of dialogue and deep listening. Fourthly, peacemaking doesn't preclude us from having enemies. Now listen to what Jesus said. Love your enemies. You know what that implies? No matter how hard we try, we're going to have some enemies. Paul said, as much as possible, be at peace with all men. As much as possible. Sometimes there's nothing we can do. We can offer forgiveness. We can extend acts of reconciliation. We're going to have enemies. People are going to be enemies to us. Jesus said, love them anyway. Don't give up on your values. Don't give up on your commitment. Don't just roll over and acquiesce. Be a peacemaker. Be strong. Be assertive. Speak your truth. You're going to have an enemy. Love them anyway. Another person I wanted to tell you about, also connected to my congregation in Florida, Bobby Mueller. Bobby is an amazing guy. He's in his 60s now. He served in Vietnam too. First lieutenant, first tour of duty in Vietnam. He was leading a battalion, a group of men, and was wounded his very first outing, and a bullet entered his chest and severed his spine, and he became paralyzed from the chest down. Bobby came home. He went to law school. Then he started the Vietnam Veterans of America organization, the largest veterans organization in the United States, which is still going, by the way. Bobby became a peace activist and an advocate for wounded soldiers. And today, having traveled millions of miles in his wheelchair all across the United States, having met every president in the past 30 years, Bobby is still advocating for wounded soldiers, now young men and women from Afghanistan and Iraq. But here's the interesting thing about his work over the years. He's become a target for people whom I would say are slightly more militaristic or defensive of U.S. foreign policy. There have even been people who have questioned his patriotism, who have accused him of various things, being unpatriotic, unsupportive of the United States. He's got some enemies. But the fact is, he's a peacemaker. He's an advocate. There's nothing he can do about that. He's not going to give up. He's just going to keep going for another 1,000,000 miles in his wheelchair. And it's an inspiring thing to see. And lastly, I want to say in terms of peacemaking is a lifelong vocation and an act of faith. This is not some flash-in-the-pan thing. This is not just some little exercise for peaceniks or some ancillary program the church starts and says, I think this year we'll do a little peacemaking. No, this is something that you and I, on a personal level, commit our lives to day after day, year after year, mile after mile, in many little ways. It doesn't have to be a big thing, one little step at a time. That's how Mildred Norman did it. Mildred Mildred Norman came to be known as the Peace Pilgrim. Anybody ever hear Mildred? Mildred, when she was about 30 years old, got a revelation. She was deep in meditation, and this is what she heard from her God: walk for peace. Never been to college, never been an activist, but she made for herself a little blue tunic, and she wrote on the back, Peace Pilgrim. And she started walking across the United States, back one time, and when she got to one side, she walked back. She walked back and forth across the United States over 15 times with that little tunic which said Peace Pilgrim. She had no sponsors, no supporters. She just walked. And her motto was this: I'll walk until I'm given shelter. I'll fast until I'm given food. And that's what she did. She was from New Jersey, by the way. Somebody knows her. Yeah. So that was her witness to peace. It was a lifelong thing. 50,000 miles on foot, one step at a time. So this is how it goes. And I think this should be at the center here at Emmanuel of our agenda. You know, there are some what I call historic peace churches, like the Church of the Brethren. That's their whole thing. But in many denominations like this one, there is certainly at its core a strong peace and justice movement. And I think there's a rich heritage of that in this congregation. And we need to remember it. We're talking about remembrances today and remembering people. Let's remember that that's been a part of the history of this church. Making peace in a violent world. So let me leave you with this little line from Takashita, the Japanese poet. I will write peace on your wings, and you will fly all over the world. Amen.